We now move on to the next talk, and that's by Dr. Madhumita Premkumar, and she would be talking to us on liver, lifestyle, and PCOS. She is the assistant professor at the Department of Hepatology at PGI Chandigarh. She's been the medical officer for the 30th Indian Scientific Expedition to the Antarctica, and also at the National Center for Antarctica and Ocean Research, Ministry of Earth Sciences, Government of India, at Headline SADA, Goa, India. She is in the medicine department of, she's the Registrar of Medicine, Department of Medicine, MAMC, New Delhi, 2011 and 12, and a senior resident in hepatology in ILBS, 2013 to 17. And at present, she's the assistant professor of hepatology at PGI Chandigarh at present. Over to you, Dr. Madhumita.
Thank you, ma'am, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers to welcome and have such a great topic for discussion. So I'll begin with sharing my slides, and I hope there will be plenty of questions because this is a question answer kind of panel. Yeah. So I'm a hepatologist, and I think that was a very long reading out of my bio, but I'm primarily a liver specialist. And since today's topic is all about PCOS, and very rightly, it is all about lifestyle and metabolic syndrome. So I'm just here to talk about the liver manifestations of it. Okay, so what happens when you have a patient with PCOS, and we have discussed the dermatological and the physiological conditions that are associated with it. So what happens if you find a patient has an incidental fatty liver in PCOS? It's a very common thing, and it affects all age groups, with about 50% of the population being overweight in metros at least. It's a very common thing. So the scenario is completely different if the patient is young, if it's a young PCOS, and completely different if the patient is an older adult with comorbidities. So how does one approach such a case? Now, NAFLD, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, is actually an association of insulin resistance when there is liver fat in more than 5% of hepatocytes. And it requires exclusion of other conditions, and one must ask if there is associated alcohol intake. Very often it comes with obesity, but there is also a phenotype called lean NASH, which happens in people who are not overweight. So PCOS is a classical example where there is insulin resistance, may not be overtly overweight, but may have NAFLD. So it ranges from a very early stage when the liver is having no fibrosis, or F0 fibrosis, where there is pure steatosis and inflammation. If there is more of inflammation, we have an increase in the liver enzymes, and that will be reflected in the LFT as an elevation in the AST, ALT, that is the SGOT or SGPT. With time, with progression, whatever inflamed area is of the liver gets replaced by fibrotic tissue, which is basically gravestones which form in areas of inflammation. In addition to NAFLD, if the patient has additional risk factors like viral hepatitis, that just adds on to the injury, and there will be accelerated fibrosis. So a young patient with PCOS is likely to be in this category, where we have either no fibrosis or very early fibrosis. And an older person with PCOS can actually be having NASH, where there is inflammation and elevated liver enzymes, or even early cirrhosis, where there is a lot of fibrosis that occurs. Please note that NAFLD is not a benign disease. NASH itself can increase mortality with associated cardiovascular disease, just like another manifestation of the metabolic syndrome. And there is a risk of hepatocellular carcinoma or even extrahepatic carcinomas in people who have NAFLD. How does one diagnose it? Well, one can just move our ultrasound probe, since all the gynecologists who are viewing this program today have access to an ultrasound machine. Just take the probe and move it to the cranial area towards the upper part of the abdomen, and you can diagnose NAFLD very easily. So the problem that everyone has already been discussing as a component of PCOS would be the elevation of serum insulin levels, which causes all the androgenic or the hirsutism and other factors that were discussed earlier. And that is actually the main problem which needs to be addressed even in patients who have fatty liver disease. In addition to that, systemic inflammation with cytokines will predispose the person to also develop accelerated CAD and also stroke. So all the other manifestations in the body of metabolic syndrome, of which NASH is just one manifestation. How can you diagnose NAFL? So that's really similar. We call it a light bulb liver. If one looks at the echogenicity as compared to the kidney, it's a very bright liver. So a grade 1 NAFL would be having increased hepatic echogenicity, but the portal vein is nicely seen with its echogenic walls, and the diaphragm is also nicely seen. So this grade 2 will be when you have some obscuration of the portal vein walls. It's not clearly visible, but the diaphragm is still visualized. And in grade 3, everything is kind of lost. The entire thing becomes obscured. So from a very clear wall definition, one can actually grade NAFLD very simply. It just takes 2 minutes. And that's where we keep the probe in the subcostal area and we align it between the ribs in the intercostal area. And for looking at the left lobe, we have to put it in the subcostal area. So that's the portal vein. Another interesting structure one sees here is the gallbladder, another manifestation. So gallstone disease. If one just looks at the gallbladder, and you can see over here, there is some sludge, but there is no acoustic shadow. So this is just gallbladder sludge. There is no stone. So that's how you can simply diagnose NAFL with whatever tools you have. Now coming back to our patient, if it's a young patient, it is likely that the person would only be in the early phase without any fibrosis. So if there's elevation in liver enzymes, there could be an AST, ALT elevation, or even a gamma GT elevation, then this person simply requires treatment, which can be done by any primary practitioner. However, in an older individual, especially, you should be worried in an older gynecological patient whom you might be ending up operating. These patients who have fibrosis, which is not innately visible, even on ultrasound, they might decompensate after the surgery. So we have patients who are referred after hysterectomy who have developed ascites as a primary manifestation of liver disease, or during the surgery were found to have a nodular looking liver. So it is really important for gynecologists to recognize that even a mild AST ALT increase can actually hide an F3 fibrosis, which can decompensate after the stress of surgery. So an older individual, one needs to look in terms of cirrhosis, and a very simple way of doing that is just the ultrasound. Another test that is commonly used is the FibroScan, which gives us which is really widely available now. It can be done either using the FibroScan machine or RFI using ultrasound. And that gives us the degree of steatosis in the liver, which is a very valuable tool to tell the person that there is so much percentage of fat in the liver and this is how much it needs to be reduced. And it also tells us about the fibrosis of the liver. In addition to just NAFLD, it's not just fatty liver that could exist. There could be comorbidities like hepatitis B or C. The person could be having alcohol, and very rarely there could be metabolic disorders like Wilson's or autoimmune disorders like AIH. So it is really important to look for obesity, insulin resistance, and comorbidities in such an individual. And I would say the Lakshman Rekha for referral would be an older individual with elevated liver enzymes, with failure of primary therapy of weight loss, or whatever treatment, for instance, you're giving in a PCOS patient. And in a pre-surgical candidate, one should have a lower threshold for referral. So we get a lot of questions about fatty liver disease and fasting, and there has been a very nice panel discussion. So one of the questions our patients ask, how soon will the steatosis disappear? When will my ultrasound completely normalize? The answer is 3 months. It can be as early as 3 months if lifestyle changes are done, but it will not reset to a normal healthy body for another 2 years. So even after disappearance of the liver fat, it's going to take another year or so for the metabolic consequences to at least partially reverse or ameliorate with therapy. Will intermittent fasting help? Yes, that's an excellent form of diet that is going to help the person actually lose weight. And I think one of the major questions that should be discussed in this forum is the role of intermittent fasting in patients with PCOS, because it could help with both NAFLD and it could also help with the insulin resistance phenomenon associated with PCOS. So intermittent fasting requires a person to fast for a minimum of 16 hours, and that's a long time. That's because that's how long it will take to reduce the insulin level. And not many people can do that. I mean, that's like having a Karwa Chauth Vrat every single day. That's to put it in perspective, because people don't realize. And you'll be amazed at the kind of questions one is asked about intermittent fasting. Like, can we have tea and coffee and biscuits? And we'll just come to that. Does a keto diet help? No, absolutely not. This is one diet fad that should be completely debunked. And very often we are having people coming in with questions about keto diet, but I would not recommend it. The only scientific evidence for it was in patients with refractory epilepsy. Do not try this. What about gallstones? Like I said, you can look for gallstones yourself, and it's just another manifestation of uh, the uh, the overall metabolic syndrome. It's excess fat, which is converted into bile, and that just gets stored in the gallbladder and crystallizes when it, the solubilization factors or bile acids are not well enough to ensure that it is uh, resolved or excreted through the bile. So will a cholecystectomy, and you'll have so many patients saying that, oh, we have got the cholecystectomy problem solved. Absolutely not. Gallstone disease is actually a disease of the liver. It is a disease which is associated with metabolic syndrome. Removing the gallbladder just takes away the telltale evidence. The problem is in the liver. The hypersecretion of cholesterol, the crystallization of stones will continue to occur, and they may occur in the biliary tract. So even after the gallbladder is removed, the problem doesn't go away. It requires holistic change of diet and lifestyle. Can dieting cause gallstones? Yes, it can. So a very important consequence of a very low calorie diet, which is given in patients, especially after bariatric surgery, another topic which may have been discussed today, was the role of bariatric surgery in extremely obese individuals. And we're getting a lot of referrals now, post-bariatric surgery, the persons are developing gallstones because they've suddenly gone from a 1500 to 2000 kilocalorie diet to a 500 kilocalorie diet, either intentionally or as a result of the bariatric surgery. And yes, it can cause gallstones, but only in very low calorie diets. Can statins worsen gallstones? Everyone is being prescribed a statin these days, especially in older individuals. In a bad microbiota, where there is systemic inflammation, statins can actually cause increased excretion of cholesterol in bile as a means of excreting it, and may precipitate gallstones in a person who's at risk for it. So I've used a number of words here. In a susceptible individual with an altered microbiome or an inflammatory microbiome who has systemic inflammation, yes, statins can actually cause the formation of gallstones. So that's what gallstones look like. Another thing that every one of you can diagnose. So when you move your ultrasound probe up to the liver, look at the gallbladder. That's the sludge that you had seen previously, but now it is casting these acoustic shadows. So these are gallstones. Also can be diagnosed by you while you're doing your routine ultrasounds. So in such patients, everybody is given another favorite drug of the market, open market. They are given UDCA or Udiliv or whatever other brand that is prescribed. So there is no indication for patients with NASH. There is no indication for patients who have gallstones to be given UDCA. The only place we do give it in those who are on very low calorie diets, who are having bariatric surgery, we might give it to ensure the excess cholesterol is solubilized and there is no precipitation of gallstones. Otherwise, there is no role of UDCA. It is a really overused, expensive, and abused drug. Uh, Thankfully, it is relatively harmless, but it does alter the gut microbiome and should not be used in clinical practice. Another question we are commonly asked and may have been discussed here is Vrat the same as intermittent fasting? The answer is no. You actually require about 16 hours of fasting. And in the more severe forms or the more advanced form of intermittent fasting, the profile is 20 hours of fasting with 4 hours of eating. 16 hours of fasting and 8 hours of eating is just the starting. So we start with 2-3 days of 12 hours fast and 12 hours eating cycle. But the more rigorous ones is one meal a day type or the warrior diet. So that is an extreme form. Another question we are asked is, in this intermittent fasting, what can be taken? So I would say tea and coffee can be taken, but our Vratwala diet, fruits, salads, no, because any kind of carb is going to raise insulin and just does away with all the benefits of the intermittent fasting. So one cannot have the single biscuit, one cannot have diet soda, it doesn't work. What can you have? Yes, you can take isabgol just to kill the appetite of, fill the stomach, and plenty of water. It is okay to take stevia in some amount and of sugar alcohol like xylitol to sweeten one's drinks, but it is not okay to take aspartame. So I hope that answers a lot of questions which people have. Fruits and salads happily taken during the Vrat period will not work in intermittent fasting. right? So to my patients, as a rule of thumb, I never advise a diet. I tell them to go for healthy eating and healthy exercise. So when we are talking about changing people's lifestyles, it's better not to give something which has a body dysmorphic image, or it's a goal that one has to give of changing one's way of eating. So healthy eating, eliminate sugar sweetened beverages. It is really shocking to see people have a lot of colas and juices. For some reason, it is ingrained in people's minds that fruit juices are healthy. And we have a lot of patients who switch to having store-bought juices, which are really sweetened. So that has to be eliminated. Controlling the amount of portions one takes. Always substituting one portion of a carb, maybe with a salad and with a fat-free yogurt, which is very good because it improves the gut microbiota. What is the cooking method used? Can we switch to a more steaming kind of meal rather than using fried foods? And of course, we entirely tell our patients to avoid fast food. So these are very simple things that physicians should tell their patients, because we just tell them diet karo. Most people go away from their doctor thinking diet karo, and we have something else in our mind, and patients have something else in their mind. So I think patient communication is really important and is crucial to management of metabolic syndrome, whether it is PCOS or NASH or any other manifestation. So intermittent fasting, like I said, one would require a minimum of 16 hours of fasting to make it work. Right, and this is a plate that we tell the patient to have. We should have whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and a healthy protein with substitutions as required. So we tell them to follow a healthy eating plate rather than a dieting plate. So question asked very commonly is, how much weight loss is actually required to have any benefit? It is possible that the patient loses some amount of weight, and it is also possible that the patient starts exercising and gains muscle mass or gains weight. So again, there is a problem, which is why body composition analysis, as pointed out by another speaker, which will tell us the amount of muscle mass, the bone densitometry, visceral fat versus parietal fat, would actually give us a good idea about therapeutic weight loss, right? So for both PCOS and NAFLD, one requires about a 10% body weight loss, and that has to be sustained for over 6 months for any metabolic benefit. And how does that help? Not only does it cause a resolution in NASH, but can also cause a fibrosis reduction. So NASH is now considered one of the reversible forms of cirrhosis, along with hepatitis C and autoimmune hepatitis. So these are treatable causes of cirrhosis now. But for fibrosis regression, one requires 10% of weight loss, which needs to be sustained. So just starting the journey is not enough. This is a long journey we have to undertake with our patients together over years, and we need to be prepared for it accordingly. So steatosis improvement, like I said, can occur within 3 months with just 3% of weight loss. But for the real inflammation to improve, we need 7 to 10% of weight loss at a minimum. So how can the gynecologist treat NASH if it is available? So this is NASH, where there's an elevation in liver enzymes and the AST/ALT has gone up. So weight loss and lifestyle, diet and exercise is the first line therapy. If required, one can give vitamin E. One of the best things which is a drug which is common to both of our fields, is the use of metformin. And it's a good drug to add, especially in a patient who has elevated liver enzymes. So that itself is an indication for starting metformin. Otherwise, we do use vitamin E in a dose of 400 to 800 units per day, but not for more than 6 months, because that has its own side effects. Again, one may require interventions for weight loss if it doesn't occur at a period of 6 months or so, because NASH is really a difficult condition to manage once it progresses to cirrhosis. In addition to not just looking at the abdomen, we have to look at other effects as well. The cardiovascular effect. Is there diastolic dysfunction? Is a person having obstructive sleep apnea? All of these things need to be done holistically. So it's a whole body examination that needs to be done. So all this can definitely be done with the use of metformin as well at the gynecologist level itself. Another question that was asked, I think, in one of the audience questions, gluten-free diet, does it help? We prescribe gluten-free diet to a lot of our patients who have celiac disease. And now it has suddenly become the public enemy number one, I think, or no, public enemy number two. COVID is definitely public enemy number one. So gluten protein. This is actually a protein which is there in the form of, iodine, and when that is digested, that in some people triggers an immune reaction. So that would be celiac disease. There is a syndrome of wheat allergy, which is called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where one is having an allergy to it. So it's not an immune reaction, it is an allergic reaction. So this would have an overlap with IBS. So in these individuals, if one does a biopsy or an endoscopy, it is completely normal. In celiac disease, if you remember, the patient's intestinal epithelium kind of completely changes. It flattens out and they have malabsorption. They have weight loss. They have protein losing enteropathy. So these are people who look like a completely different phenotype to people with NASH metabolic syndrome who are slightly overweight. So the treatment for celiac disease is not going to work in anybody with PCOS. So please do not try it. This is another fat diet and might actually worsen PCOS and also NAFLD, because gluten-free diet is actually having more of fat. If you look at all the diet plans that are available, it has more of processed grain and more of fat. So the only condition that actually where gluten-free diet would work is celiac disease, where you have an immune reaction and the flattening of the epithelium. So this is a disease. Wheat allergy may respond to restriction of wheat, but does not require elimination of wheat from the diet. And there is non-celiac gluten sensitivity where they are at risk of disease. So I don't think one should recommend gluten-free diet because it might actually worsen our risk. Not only that, gluten-free diet is actually expensive. So it might also affect our gut microbiota, increase intestinal permeability, increase systemic inflammation because of gut translocation, and that actually worsens the phenotype. So gluten-free is not for everyone. Please instruct your patients accordingly. Another question which is commonly asked is milk. So milk is now, everyone is taking a relook at the use of milk. We have patients who have bloating and just some kind of dyspepsia. Everyone in India says gastritis, very commonly, or reflux disease. And the first thing their gastroenterologist tells them is please eliminate milk, because the reason is 90% of Indians are actually lactose intolerant. So if the individual is lactose intolerant and the lactose in milk is not getting digested, then that causes bloating. So is it a pro-inflammatory food? Not unless one is lactose intolerant, and a small amount wouldn't harm. Is there evidence of decreased morbidity by going vegan? No, there is no additional benefit by going vegan over and above a healthy lifestyle. That's a lifestyle choice. There is no scientific benefit to say that a vegan diet is going to be better. And what about interspecies milk? Well, all commercially available milk is actually going to be interspecies because we are humans, and any other milk we drink is going to be interspecies. A2 milk. So the protein which is there in milk, we're not talking about lactose here. We're talking about the protein, and that's going to be casein. So casein is of various types. And in cow milk, there is something called an A1 type of casein. And in non-cow milk, so we have buffalo, camel, donkey, which is now increasingly becoming popular, has the A2 variety of protein. So a lot of people ask, is it beneficial to switch to A2 milk? It's thrice as expensive. In fact, camels only produce milk as long as their child is with them, and they produce milk only for 6 hours, and a camel produces something like 8 liters of milk a day as compared to 50 liters for bovine milk production. So there is no benefit scientifically for A2 milk. Again, this is another milk fat which needs to be dispelled. What does work is in A2 milk, there's a lower amount of lactose. So if the person is lactose intolerant and they switch to A2 milk, then they might have some benefit. So a question, is all milk cross-species milk? Well, humans are not the only one who have cross-species milk. Other than our domestic cats, there are these three animals, red-billed, oxpecker, seagulls, and sheep-bills, which also in nature drink milk from other species. That's just a bit of trivia I threw in. So we are not the only culprits. And the reason people prefer bovine milk is because it is pretty much similar in composition to human milk. That is why we get away with drinking it for so long into adulthood also. Is there any deleterious consequence? Is it inflammatory? Not really. And as a hepatologist and I deal with patients with cirrhosis, it's a good source of protein in a vegetarian country like ours. So I would not advise eliminating milk from the diet. In fact, I would recommend the use of it in yogurt because that gives a good amount of calcium, it gives protein, and it ensures that there's a good microbiota in the gut. So yogurt is a wonder food. I wouldn't advise anyone to eliminate milk entirely unless they are lactose intolerant, in which case yogurt is the only thing they can take, because they can't take milk and they can't take paneer or cheese. So not much evidence to support the use of milk, but some evidence definitely to use it in patients, especially who are sarcopenic. So lactase persistence, the role of IGF-1 and diabetes, I think in PCOS that's important, because cows are often injected with growth hormone, and that can actually result in IGF-1 being present in milk. So can that actually trigger off insulin resistance in humans? The answer is no, it cannot, because once we ingest the milk, the growth hormone that is there in the milk, which is given to the cow, it's not going to affect us. It'll just get hydrolyzed and does not cause insulin resistance in humans. So that's another misconception that people have. But yes, all the antibiotics that people are injecting in the bovine industry is a major issue. And of course, climate change is a major issue. So for those reasons alone, one might consider removing dairy from the diet, but there's no scientific evidence per se to support it. So that's what lactose intolerance is all about. And it does create a lot of problems and is inflammatory in people who are lactose intolerant. So I will end my FAQ questions there. So this was a very short presentation on the pertinent questions in liver disease and lifestyle and PCOS. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Madhumita. I think that was a lovely presentation. We do have some audience questions. Dr. Madhuri, can we go ahead? Do we still have time?
Yeah, so I would like to ask her, so as we normally do a lipid profile and we also look for glucose intolerance in PCOS women, so do you think all the PCOS women should undergo LFT, and also we need to look for fatty liver?
Yes, ideally speaking, when we are doing PCOS and ultrasound is being done in any case, it would be worthwhile to screen for NAFLD, especially in those who are obese, because the pickup value in people who are overweight is up to 50%. So, and in those individuals, if there is an elevation in liver enzymes, then it's really important to, it's a red flag to ask them to reduce weight immediately and work on their diet and lifestyle. And that is one thing that people accept as an inducement to changing lifestyle, because fatty liver is now common and people know about it, and it actually makes them present to physicians. So I think it's a good teaching moment to use both PCOS and NAFLD.
And should we also, I mean, all of us, we just do the weight and we do the BMI. We really do not do the body composition. So you think that also, I think, is very important.
I agree with you, ma'am. Ideally speaking, it's again, you know, visually, for example, in our patients with NAFLD, especially those with early fibrosis, we do a fibroscan. So that gives us a controlled attenuation parameter or CAP value and an LSM liver stiffness value. So it's like a graph, and it visually tells a person, you know, that's what it's like. In fact, when I do a CT scan, I kind of hold it up and show them that this is your rib cage, this is the muscle, this is your pelvic bone, this is your psoas, and that's all the muscle you have. And all the rest of the shadows all fat. So get rid of that. So just using these simple visual tools gives an idea to the patient that something is seriously wrong. Someone pointed out that someone with a BMI of 21 who's perfectly healthy, after they have, you know, changed their lifestyle, put on some muscle mass, they actually look great. But our Indian mindset is, oh, you're looking so thin, is your wife not feeding you, and things like that. So visual tool would actually help. A BCA test, body composition analysis test, is expensive. But in an older individual who is obese, who is a gynecological patient, doing a BCA is helpful because it gives you the bone densitometry. So let's not forget metabolic bone health as well while we're looking for these factors.
And what about the microbiome? Would you, how would you really diagnose, or would you treat it without diagnosing in all PCOS women?
So that's an excellent question. So I think the most important driver of inflammation in the body is the gut. So the use of the word gut feeling is absolutely right. So the microbiota is what has actually changed over the last maybe decade or so. Earlier, we used the kind of meals we used to have with less of processed food, with less of dairy industry, the less of pesticides, etc. We had a very healthy relationship with our gut. And that's what actually talks with our food, triggers of inflammation, talks to the liver through the portal circulation, and triggers off the entire metabolic and systemic inflammatory profile in the body. So if we treat our gut well, reduce inflammation, that will automatically make sure. So what does one do require to actually manage? But that requires a full stool or fecal microbiota analysis. It's an expensive test because we do the full PCR for all the bacterial, viral, and fungal microbiome. So it's not a simple test to do and is not required in clinical practice. A simple analysis of the patient's symptoms of systemic inflammation is good enough to diagnose whether there's a problem. In fact, the rise in irritable bowel syndrome also, other than lactose intolerance, which is now being increasingly diagnosed, is due to a poor lifestyle. It is due to our being sedentary and having too much of processed meals. So having enough of yogurt, having salads, having a good FODMAP-based diet, that itself is going to take care of gut inflammation.
Sabat, there are some 3-4 questions. Are you going to ask or shall I ask? Sabat? Okay, she's not there. So so how to prescribe OC pills in in patients with hepatitis, or it is totally contraindicated?
It's not contraindicated. Excellent question. So we do have reports where ethinyl estradiol based pills, they do trigger off an increase in LFT. In patients with viral hepatitis, it's not really a problem because both are very treatable. In hepatitis C, we have a cure. In hepatitis B, we have good viral suppression. So with good monitoring of LFT, if there is no idiosyncratic reaction, then we are good to go. But for progestins, we have had cases of drug-induced liver injury. They are very rare, but they do appear. So I think it would be worthwhile, other than looking for breast nodules and screening for cancers and starting estrogens or oral contraceptive pills, it would be worthwhile to look at an LFT as well.
There's another question on what will be the cutoff for metformin contraindication in cases with raised OT and PT.
We actually love to give metformin because it works to reduce OT and PT. So please go ahead and give metformin for patients with NASH, because that is, I think our pharmacology textbooks were full with, there might be lactic acidosis and there's a mitochondrial damage with metformin. That is not true. Those were anecdotal evidences that have entered our textbooks, but metformin is an excellent drug. It's an insulin sensitizer. It reduces hepatic inflammation through myriad ways. It helps with systemic inflammation. So it's an excellent drug for both PCOS as well as NASH. So go ahead and prescribe it.
Dr. Manju is asking if bajra, jawar, millet, besan and moong dal and all these are much better in the diet for PCOS women.
So I think this jawar, bajra, ragi, these are millets. They are very good, and I don't know why they have been eliminated from the Indian diet. So these are good, not in terms of they are having a health benefit in themselves, but they are a good source of calcium. Ragi, for instance, is one of the best sources of calcium. They are a good source of fiber and are higher, wheat versus wheat, they are having higher amounts of protein. Bioavailability is a different question, but it improves the gut in the sense that because of the fibrous content of these, it improves the gut microbiota. So yes, using this is a good idea. And in a gluten-free diet, in fact, we tell them to take jawar, bajra, ragi, but that's because we want to eliminate wheat entirely from the diet.
And what about the use of different dals? Like, is it better?
The use of dals. Okay, so another thing that has to be told when people are on a diet is mix of dals would actually give different essential amino acids are there in different dals. So using, we in fact tell our cirrhotics that if you're having moong dal one day, have arhar dal the next, and have a mix of different legumes as well. So peas or rajma or chole. So that has to be taken in a cyclical fashion to ensure there are enough essential amino acids. Not only that, even oils, one should mix and match oils because essential fatty acids, sometimes one takes olive, sometimes one should take rice bran or sunflower or whatever is the oil of choice in moderation, but one should keep adding on multiple so that all EFAs are covered.
Yeah. Thank you, Madhumita, for that great,
so
brilliant lecture and all the questions answered.